a bounty hunter chasing ghosts, a woman hiding a deadly secret, and a town where everyone lies. What happens when the truth is more dangerous than the outlaws themselves? On this channel, we explore stories of the Wild West, filled with cowboys, love, family bonds, and the compassion that keeps people human in brutal times. The meaning of this story: truth may be buried, but it never dies. If you want more stories like this, remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe.
Silas Thorne didn't pull his buckskin gelding to a halt out of the goodness of his heart. He stopped because the buzzards circling the Montana scrubgrass were getting impatient with a corpse that refused to die. The mid-afternoon sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on a landscape baked into shades of cracked ochre and dead gold. Silas sat perfectly still in the saddle, his weathered duster coated in a layer of pale trail dust. Beneath the wide brim of his Stetson, his slate-gray eyes tracked the heavy, black-winged scavengers, swooping dangerously low over a patch of tall, rippling buffalo grass about 50 yards off the main trail. Usually, out here in the unforgiving expanse of the territory, a body was just a body. A prospector whose luck ran dry, a drifter who crossed the wrong men, or an outlaw who caught a bullet instead of a payday. Silas was in the business of outlaws. The bounties in his saddlebags were heavy enough to buy him whiskey and a warm bed for a month, but the men he was truly hunting, the Rust Creek boys, were still ghosts in the wind. He didn't have time for a detour, but the buckskin shifted uncomfortably, its ears pinned back, smelling the sharp, metallic tang of blood carrying on the hot breeze. "All right, easy," Silas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He swung down from the saddle, the silver spurs on his boots biting into the dry earth with a soft clink. Habit, carved into his bones by years of violence, had his right hand resting casually on the worn walnut grip of his Colt .45 as he waded into the sea of grass. He expected a dead man. What he found made his jaw lock so hard his teeth ached. It was a woman. She lay crumpled on her side, half buried in the thorny brush, her simple blue calico dress torn and soaked in drying dark crimson patches. The sheer brutality of the scene made Silas stop dead in his tracks. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a stagecoach robbery or a wild animal attack. This was deliberate. Her face was a horrific canvas of purple and black. One eye was swollen completely shut, the skin around it split and crusted with dried blood. Her lower lip was split in 2 places, and her honey-blonde hair was matted to her skull with gore. Dust coated her pale skin, making her look like a discarded porcelain doll that someone had taken a hammer to. Silas let out a slow, hissed breath. God Almighty! He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her battered frame, offering a momentary reprieve from the blistering sun. He reached out with a calloused hand, 2 fingers pressing gently against the side of her throat, searching for a pulse he was certain wouldn't be there. Beneath his fingertips, her skin was burning with fever, but there was a flutter, faint, erratic, but stubbornly there. Suddenly her chest hitched. A ragged, wet gasp tore from her throat. Silas tensed, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster, but the woman didn't scream. She didn't flail or weep. Slowly, agonizingly, her one good eye fluttered open. It was a startling, piercing shade of blue, entirely out of place in a face so broken. For a long moment she just stared at him. She took in the scarred line of his jaw, the cold neutrality in his eyes, the heavy artillery strapped to his hips, and the silver badge of a bounty hunter pinned to the inside of his open coat. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice softer than it had been in years, keeping his hands where she could see them. "You're bad off, ma'am. Don't try to move. I'm going to get my canteen." He unhooked the leather-wrapped flask from his belt, popped the cork with his thumb, and carefully supported the back of her head. Her hair was stiff with blood, and she bit back a whimper of pain as he elevated her just enough to tip the water to her cracked lips. She swallowed greedily, choking slightly before turning her head away. She lay back, her breathing shallow, her blue eye fixing on him with an intensity that unsettled him. Most women, hell, most men in her condition would be sobbing, begging for mercy, or praying to whatever god they thought was listening. But this woman was analyzing him, calculating. "You're a hunter," she rasped, her voice tearing like dry canvas. "Bounty hunter," Silas corrected quietly. "Silas Thorne." Thorne. She tested the name, her throat working past the pain. She didn't ask who had done this to her. She didn't ask where she was. She already knew. "I'm going to lift you onto my horse," Silas said, his professional detachment kicking in to mask the rising disgust he felt for whoever had left her here. "The nearest town is Oakhaven. They've got a Sawbones. If we ride slow, you might make it." "No." The word was weak, but the absolute refusal behind it made Silas pause. He frowned, a dark line forming between his brows. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of pride you're holding on to, but you're bleeding out in the dirt. Another hour in this sun, and the buzzards are going to have you for supper." "Oakhaven," she breathed out. A bitter, agonizing sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't brought a trickle of fresh blood from the corner of her mouth. "He's in Oakhaven." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Who?" "My husband." The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the humid summer air. Silas looked at the defensive bruises on her forearms, the precise, punishing strikes that had nearly caved in her ribs. He had hunted killers, thieves, and arsonists. But the men who did this sort of work in the privacy of their own homes were a different breed of coward entirely. "He did this to you," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. Clara Vance didn't nod. Moving her head took too much energy. Instead, she let her good eye burn into his. She had spent the last 3 years playing the obedient, terrified wife. She had taken the hits, swallowed the lies, and quietly, meticulously, mapped out every corner of Elias Vance's filthy empire until she knew exactly where the rot started. And last night, when he caught her prying up the floorboards in the stable, he had tried to beat her into the grave to keep his secrets buried. He thought he had succeeded. He was wrong. "Listen to me, Silas Thorne," Clara whispered, her hand trembling as she reached up. Her blood-crusted fingers clamped weakly onto the coarse fabric of his duster. There was no warmth in her grip, only desperation and an iron-forged will. "I'm listening," Silas said, genuinely captivated. "You take me into that town. He'll finish the job." She paused, fighting a wave of nausea. "But if you get me to that doctor and keep me breathing through the night—" "I'm not a bodyguard, ma'am. I track men with prices on their heads." "I know," Clara breathed, her vision swimming, the edges of the world turning black. She forced herself to hold onto consciousness for just 10 seconds more. "You're chasing the Rust Creek boys. I've seen the wanted posters. You've been chasing them for years." Silas went entirely rigid. The blood in his veins ran suddenly, dangerously cold. "How do you know that?" "Because my husband is the one who pays them." Clara's grip tightened on his coat, a final desperate anchor to the living world. "Keep me alive, Thorne. Get me to that doctor. Keep his men away from me. And I will give you the head of the man who owns your bounties." Her hand went slack, slipping from his coat to hit the dry earth with a dull thud. Her eye rolled back, and she finally surrendered to the darkness, slipping into unconsciousness. Silas knelt there in the blistering heat, staring down at the broken, bloody woman who had just offered him the key to a vengeance he had been chasing for half a decade. He looked up at the buzzards still circling lazily against the glaring sun. "Not today, boys," Silas muttered. He holstered his weapon, slid his arms beneath her battered body, and lifted her from the dirt. She weighed practically nothing, a fragile collection of shattered bones and bruised flesh. But as Silas carried her toward his horse, he knew he wasn't holding a victim. He was holding a stick of dynamite, and the fuse was already lit. The town of Oakhaven did not welcome strangers. It swallowed them. As Silas Thorne rode down the main thoroughfare under the bruised purple canopy of twilight, he could feel the town's rot settling into his lungs. It smelled of sulfur, stale beer, and the pervasive, suffocating dust that coated the false front buildings like a shroud. He kept his buckskin gelding at a slow, measured walk, keeping to the deeper shadows of the alleyways. Draped across the saddle in front of him, hidden beneath the heavy, sweat-stained canvas of his duster, was Clara Vance. She hadn't made a sound since she passed out on the trail, her breath so shallow it barely stirred the fabric covering her battered face. Silas knew Oakhaven by reputation. It was a boom town built on dirty money and blind eyes, a place where the law was bought by the hour and justice was whatever the man with the deepest pockets said it was. And according to the broken woman bleeding onto his saddle, the man with the deepest pockets was her husband. He navigated the maze of back alleys until he spotted the faded wooden sign swinging on a rusted hinge. Dr. Thaddeus Abernathy, Medicine and Surgery. Silas dismounted silently, scanning the shadowed street. Satisfied they were unobserved, he gathered Clara into his arms, carrying her up the wooden back steps. He didn't bother knocking. He kicked the back door open with the heel of his boot, stepping into a room thick with the scent of carbolic acid and old tobacco. Doc Abernathy, a stooped man with a shock of thinning gray hair and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, jumped so violently he nearly knocked over a tray of surgical instruments. "What in the blazes?" Abernathy began, his hand instinctively dropping toward the drawer where he kept a derringer. "Put the gun away, Doc," Silas rumbled, stepping into the lamplight. He lowered Clara onto the leather examination table with a surprising gentleness. "You're going to need both hands for this." Abernathy adjusted his spectacles, his annoyance evaporating into pure, unfiltered horror as he pulled back the duster. "Merciful heavens, who did this?" "Right now, that doesn't matter," Silas said, stepping back to let the older man work. "What matters is if she's going to live." Abernathy didn't answer immediately. His hands, though age-spotted and trembling slightly, moved with practiced efficiency. He began to wipe away the crust of blood and dirt, his breath hitching as the full extent of Clara's injuries was revealed. Beneath the physical agony, Clara's mind was trapped in a fractured, terrifying loop. As the doctor's alcohol-soaked cotton touched her split brow, the sting threw her violently back to the previous night. The lantern light flickered in the drafty stable. The smell of sweet hay and horse manure was thick in the air. Clara was on her knees, her fingernails bleeding as she pried up the loose floorboard in the empty third stall. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had finally found it. The leather-bound ledger, the absolute proof that her husband, Elias Vance, the respected mercantile owner, was the shadow broker funding the territory's deadliest outlaws. She had her fingers brush the cracked leather cover. Freedom. It was right there. Then the heavy thud of a boot against the stable door. "Looking for something, my sweet?" Elias's voice was smooth, like dark honey poured over glass. Clara froze. She hadn't even heard him cross the yard. He stepped into the lantern light, immaculately dressed in his tailored waistcoat, his handsome face twisted into a mask of cold, calculating fury. She didn't have time to scream. The first blow caught her across the cheekbone, a flash of white-hot agony that sent her crashing into the dirt. He didn't use a weapon. He used his fists, his heavy boots stripping away the refined gentleman to reveal the monster beneath. He demanded to know who she had told. She kept her mouth shut, swallowing her own blood, her eyes locked on the floorboard she had hastily kicked back into place. He didn't know the ledger was still there. He thought she had already moved it. That singular thought was the only thing that kept her sane as the darkness finally took her. "She's fighting it," Doc Abernathy muttered, pulling Silas back to the present. He wrapped a tight bandage around Clara's ribs. 3 cracked ribs, a severe concussion, dehydration and blood loss. She's lucky to be breathing, Thorne. Whoever did this left her for the buzzards. "Yeah," Silas said, his voice devoid of emotion, though his slate-gray eyes were cold as ice. "Keep her quiet. Lock the door. If anyone asks, you've been drinking alone all night. I need to go see a man about a horse." Silas slipped out the back door, melting into the night. He didn't go far. He navigated the muddy streets until he reached the Golden Nugget Saloon, the loudest and brightest building in Oakhaven. Pushing through the swinging doors, Silas let the wall of noise wash over him. A tinny piano clattered in the corner, drowned out by the raucous laughter of prospectors, gamblers, and hired guns. Silas moved to the edge of the bar, ordered a whiskey he didn't intend to drink, and let his eyes scan the room. It didn't take long to find him. Sitting at the center poker table, holding court like a grieving king, was Elias Vance. He was a striking man, clean-shaven with sharply chiseled features and dark, expressive eyes that currently shone with manufactured unshed tears. "I tell you, gentlemen, it was a nightmare," Elias was saying, his voice carrying just enough to draw the sympathy of the surrounding tables. He took a slow, deliberate sip of bourbon. "We were 5 miles out of town. A dozen riders came out of the brush. Savages. I fired until my Winchester clicked empty, but there were too many." Elias buried his face in his hands, a masterful performance of a broken man. "They took the wagon. They took my Clara. By the time I came to, they were gone into the hills." "We'll find her, Elias," a gruff voice promised. Silas shifted his gaze. Standing beside Elias, a sympathetic hand resting on the merchant's shoulder, was a man wearing the tin star of a town sheriff. Sheriff Miller was a wide, barrel-chested man with a weak chin and eyes that constantly darted around the room, assessing threats. "I've got deputies organizing a posse at first light," Miller declared loudly, ensuring the whole saloon heard the law was on the job. "If those Rust Creek boys think they can take a decent man's wife in my county, they've got another thing coming." Silas gripped his shot glass, his knuckles turning white. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Elias wasn't just covering up an attempted murder. He was using his wife's abduction to rile up a posse, likely to hunt down a rival gang or to solidify his control over the town's sympathies. And the sheriff was playing right into it, either too stupid to see the truth or more likely too well paid to care. Clara was right. The law wouldn't help them here. The law was drinking bourbon with the devil. Silas tossed a silver coin onto the scarred mahogany bar and turned on his heel. He had seen enough. The town of Oakhaven was a trap, and Elias Vance had his hand on the spring. Silas needed to get back to the clinic. He needed to figure out how to transport a critically injured woman across 100 miles of hostile territory with a corrupt posse on their heels. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Silas touched the worn grip of his Colt. The bounty on the Rust Creek boys had kept him riding for 5 years, but as he thought of the battered woman lying on Abernathy's table, the money suddenly seemed entirely irrelevant. This wasn't about a bounty anymore. This was an execution. Pain was not a new sensation for Clara Vance, but the relentless, throbbing agony that greeted her as she clawed her way back to consciousness was a revelation. It felt as though her skull was filled with broken glass, and every breath she drew pulled against a corset of barbed wire. She kept her eyes closed for a long moment, listening. She heard the soft ticking of a pocket watch, the scratch of a match flaring, and the distinct acrid scent of cheap tobacco smoke. Not Elias's imported cigars. Slowly she opened her good eye. The room was dim, illuminated only by a single kerosene lamp turned down low. Sitting in a rickety wooden chair tilted back against the doorframe was Silas Thorne. He had his Stetson pulled low over his eyes, a thin cheroot clamped between his teeth, and a Winchester rifle resting casually across his thighs. He looked like a guardian demon sent to watch over the gates of hell. "You're awake," Silas noted, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. He let the chair drop forward on all 4 legs and stood, moving to the bedside with a glass of water. Clara tried to push herself up, biting down hard on the inside of her lip to keep from crying out as her cracked ribs protested. Silas didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her to lie down and rest. He simply slid a strong, calloused hand behind her shoulders and helped her sit up just enough to drink. "Where is he?" she rasped, the water soothing her parched throat. "Holding court at the Golden Nugget," Silas replied, stepping back. "Playing the weeping widower. He's telling everyone a pack of outlaws ambushed your wagon. Sheriff Miller is organizing a posse at dawn to go looking for you." Clara let out a bitter, breathless sound. "Of course he is. Miller is a dog on Elias's leash. He eats from his hand." "So I gathered," Silas said. He pulled up a stool and sat, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face level with hers. The dim light cast harsh shadows over his scarred jaw. "I held up my end of the bargain, Mrs. Vance. You're alive and you're at the doctor's. Now, you said you could give me the man who pays the Rust Creek boys." "I can," Clara said, her voice gaining a fraction of its strength. She looked at the bounty hunter, measuring him. He was a dangerous man, a killer by trade, but right now his violence was the only shield she had. "Elias doesn't just run the mercantile, he runs the county. He launders the money for the Rust Creek boys, sells them their guns, and buys the gold they steal from the federal transports at 30 cents on the dollar." Silas's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint sparking in the slate-gray depths. "That's a tall accusation for a shopkeeper. You have proof?" "A ledger," Clara stated flatly. "Bound in black leather. Every transaction, every bribe paid to Miller, every stolen shipment. It's all recorded in his own handwriting. With that book, a federal judge in Wyoming can hang him, the sheriff, and every outlaw on his payroll." "Where is it?" Clara took a slow, agonizing breath. "Under the floorboards. In the third stall of our stable. At my house." Silas stared at her for a long, quiet moment. He reached up, pinching the bridge of his nose as a humorless sigh escaped his lips. "Let me get this straight. The evidence to bring down a criminal empire is currently sitting on the property of the man who wants you dead, surrounded by a town full of people who work for him?" "Yes." "And you want me to go get it?" "No," Clara said, her blue eye blazing with a sudden fierce intensity that made Silas pause. "I want you to take me with you to get it." Silas let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Lady, you can barely sit up without passing out. You're not walking 6 blocks through a hostile town." "I have to," Clara insisted, pushing the blanket off her legs. The effort made her pale skin turn completely ashen, but she didn't stop. "The floorboards are nailed down to look untouched. There's a false bottom. You won't find it in the dark without making noise, and Elias is a light sleeper. If he catches you, he'll kill you, and then he'll come find me." She swung her bare feet over the edge of the examination table. The room spun violently, and she pitched forward. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. His hands gripped her upper arms, steadying her. She felt fragile, like a bird with hollow bones, but the sheer willpower radiating from her was staggering. She didn't flinch from his touch. She leaned into it, using him as a brace to force herself upright. "You're insane," Silas muttered, looking down at her battered face. "I'm out of options, Mr. Thorne, and so are you." She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "He thinks I'm dead on the prairie. By tomorrow morning, when his posse doesn't find my body, he'll know someone intervened. He'll search this clinic. We leave tonight, or we don't leave at all." Silas knew she was right. The tactical disadvantage of carrying a wounded woman into the enemy's camp was massive, but leaving the ledger behind meant spending the rest of their lives running from Elias's endless resources. "Fine," Silas growled, his jaw setting into a hard line. "But if things go south, I shoot first, and we ask the devil for forgiveness later." Doc Abernathy, who had been listening from the doorway, hurried over with a dark wool cloak. "Put this over her. It'll hide the bandages. God be with you both. You're walking into the viper's nest." 10 minutes later, Silas and Clara slipped out into the alley. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. The oppressive heat of the day had broken, replaced by a biting chill that made Clara shiver violently against Silas's side. He kept his arm securely around her waist, practically carrying half her weight, as they navigated the shadows behind the saloon and the livery. Every step was a fresh wave of torture for Clara. Her ribs ground together and her head throbbed in time with her racing pulse, but she forced her feet to keep moving. She focused on the smell of Silas's leather duster and the quiet, rhythmic clink of his spurs, using his steady presence to anchor herself to the waking world. They reached the edge of the Vance property. It was a large, two-story Victorian house that loomed against the night sky like a physical manifestation of Elias's ego. 50 yards behind the house stood the large timber stable. "Stay in the shadows," Silas breathed, his hand hovering over his colt as they crossed the open yard. They reached the stable doors. Silas eased one open, wincing at the faint creak of the iron hinges. The interior was pitch black, smelling of oats, damp earth, and faintly the metallic tang of Clara's own dried blood from the night before. "Third stall," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Silas guided her blindly through the darkness. The horses shifted in their stalls, nickering softly at the intrusion. Silas held his breath, praying the animals wouldn't panic. They reached the third stall. It was empty. Clara dropped to her knees, biting her tongue until she tasted copper to suppress a groan of pain. Her hands, scraped and bruised, frantically felt along the edge of the wooden floorboards, counting from the left wall. "Here," she breathed. Silas knelt beside her. He drew a heavy hunting knife from his boot, wedging the thick steel blade into the invisible seam Clara pointed out. With a quiet grunt of effort, he pried the board upward. It gave way with a soft crack of splintering wood. Clara plunged her hand into the dark cavity beneath. Her fingers brushed the familiar worn leather of the ledger. A wave of profound relief washed over her, so intense it nearly made her dizzy. She pulled it free, clutching it to her chest like a newborn child. "I have it," she whispered, looking at Silas in the dark. For a fraction of a second, victory seemed within their grasp. Then, the heavy crunch of boots on gravel echoed from the yard outside. Silas froze. Clara stopped breathing. A beam of yellow light cut through the cracks in the stable walls. Someone was walking from the back porch of the house toward the stables carrying a lantern. "Who's out there?" It was Elias. His voice was no longer the smooth, grieving tone he had used in the saloon. It was sharp, paranoid, and laced with absolute malice. The heavy clack-clack of a lever-action rifle chambering a round shattered the silence of the night. Silas's hand whipped down, drawing his Colt .45 in a blur of motion. He pushed Clara behind him into the corner of the stall, his body shielding hers entirely as the stable doors began to swing wide open. The beam of yellow lantern light sliced through the cracks of the stable walls, sliding across the dirt floor like a searching, luminous blade. Silas Thorne didn't breathe. He kept Clara pressed flush against the rough-hewn timber of the back corner, his broad body angled to completely shield her. Outside, the crunch of boots on the gravel grew louder, accompanied by the low, murmuring voices of several men. Elias Vance hadn't come out to check the horses alone. "I'm telling you, boss. I heard wood snapping," a gruff voice grunted. "Then go in and look, Briggs," Elias's voice replied, smooth and dripping with aristocratic impatience, yet laced with a paranoid edge. "If it's a horse thief, shoot him. If it's that stray dog from the saloon, shoot it too. I have a posse riding out at dawn, and I won't have my sleep disturbed." Clara's fingers dug into the back of Silas's heavy leather duster, her knuckles white as bone as she clutched the black ledger to her chest. She could picture Elias perfectly, standing safely back in the yard, letting his hired muscle do the dirty work. He was a coward wrapped in fine wool and silk. The heavy iron latch of the stable door rattled, then lifted with a metallic clank. Silas's slate-gray eyes adjusted to the sudden influx of moonlight and lantern glare as the double doors swung wide. Two men stepped into the threshold. They were rough-looking coyotes, wearing dust-caked riding coats and holstered revolvers. Rust Creek boys, without a doubt. The one in front, Briggs, held the lantern high in his left hand, his right resting on the grip of a Smith & Wesson. Nothing out here but the mares, Briggs muttered, taking a step deeper into the center aisle. The lantern light swung wildly, casting long, monstrous shadows against the rafters. "Check the stalls," the second man growled, stepping in behind him with a Winchester rifle held at the ready. Silas didn't wait for the light to hit them. In the brutal mathematics of a gunfight, the man who acted first usually walked away. With emotion so fluid it was practically a blur, Silas stepped out from the darkness of the third stall. He didn't issue a warning. He didn't shout for them to drop their weapons. He simply raised his Colt .45 and squeezed the trigger. The stable erupted in a deafening, thunderous roar. The muzzle flash painted the interior in a strobe of blinding white and violent yellow. Silas's first bullet caught Briggs dead center in the chest. The impact threw the outlaw backward off his feet. The lantern shattered on the hard-packed dirt, instantly igniting a scattered pile of dry hay. Flames licked upward, casting a hellish dancing glow over the chaotic scene. The second man barely had time to register the gunshot before Silas fanned the hammer of his Colt. A second shot rang out, punching through the man's shoulder and spinning him around like a broken top, his Winchester clattering uselessly to the floor. "Move!" Silas roared over the ringing in their ears. He reached back, grabbing Clara by the forearm. Pain flared through her broken ribs like a branding iron, stealing the breath from her lungs, but she didn't stumble. Driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline, she forced her legs to work, clutching the ledger as Silas practically dragged her down the center aisle toward the open doors. "They're in the stable!" someone outside yelled. Gunfire erupted from the yard. Bullets splintered the wooden door frames, sending showers of sharp pine raining down on them. Silas returned fire blindly into the dark, his Colt bucking in his hand as he provided covering fire. He shoved Clara out the side door, into the narrow, shadowed alley that ran between the livery and the Vance property. "Keep your head down and run for the street," Silas ordered, rapidly reloading his revolver by touch, his thumb sliding fresh brass cartridges into the cylinder. "My horse is tied behind the saloon. Go." "I can't outrun them," Clara gasped, leaning heavily against the alley wall, tasting blood in her mouth. Every inhalation was a battle against her own shattered body. "You don't have to outrun them. You just have to outrun the bullets," Silas snapped, his eyes constantly scanning the dark rooftops and the edges of the flickering firelight spilling from the stable. They made it to the end of the alley, the chaotic shouting of Elias's men echoing behind them. The town of Oakhaven was waking up. Lanterns were flickering on in upper-story windows, and dogs were barking frantically at the sound of gunfire. Silas let out a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the clamor. A moment later, his massive buckskin gelding came trotting out from the shadows behind the golden nugget, its ears pricked forward, unfazed by the noise. "Up you go," Silas said, grabbing Clara by the waist. He ignored her muffled cry of agony, practically throwing her into the saddle. Suddenly, the heavy crack of a rifle echoed, not from the yard behind them, but from above. A bullet slammed into the dirt just inches from Silas's boot, kicking up a spray of gravel. Silas dove hard to the ground, rolling behind a stack of empty whiskey barrels as a second shot splintered the wood right where his head had been a second before. Clara clung to the saddle horn, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up through the darkness. Silhouetted against the starry night sky, crouching on the flat roof of the mercantile building across the street, was a third sniper. He was taking his time, working the lever of his rifle, trying to get a clear angle on Silas behind the barrels. Silas was pinned. If he stepped out to mount the horse, the sniper would put a bullet through his chest. If he stayed put, Elias and the rest of the thugs would pour out of the alley and corner him. Clara looked down. Lying in the mud, dropped by a fleeing drunk or perhaps one of the deputies rushing to the commotion, was a heavy Winchester repeating rifle. She didn't think. The terrified, submissive wife she had played for 3 years had died in the dirt on the prairie. Sliding precariously down from the saddle, Clara hit the ground on her knees. The impact sent a shockwave of agony through her battered torso, so intense her vision swam with black spots. But she forced her eyes to focus. She grabbed the cold steel barrel of the Winchester, dragging it into her lap. It was heavy, far heavier than the small derringers Elias kept in his desk. She gritted her teeth, bracing the wooden stock awkwardly against her uninjured shoulder, avoiding her broken collarbone. She cocked the lever. The mechanical clack was a satisfying, solid sound. "Clara, stay down!" Silas yelled from behind the barrels, popping out to fire a blind shot at the roof. She ignored him. She raised the barrel, resting it against the wooden post of the hitching rail to steady her trembling hands. She peered down the iron sights, finding the dark silhouette on the roof. She remembered the nights Elias had forced her to watch him shoot bottles off the fence line, mocking her flinching. She remembered the mechanics. Exhale. Don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze. She let out a ragged breath. She squeezed. The Winchester roared, kicking back like a stubborn mule. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, tearing a scream from her throat as fresh fire erupted in her chest. But on the roof, the silhouette jerked violently backward. The sniper's rifle fired harmlessly into the sky before the man tumbled over the false front of the building, hitting the dusty street below with a sickening, lifeless thud. Silas stared at the fallen man, then snapped his gaze to Clara. She was kneeling in the dirt, the smoking rifle still clutched in her hands, her blue eye wide and wild in the pale moonlight. For a fraction of a second, the bounty hunter looked at her, not with pity, but with profound, undisguised awe. "Come on!" Silas roared, breaking from cover. He grabbed the Winchester from her hands, tossing it into the saddle scabbard, and lifted her back onto the buckskin with effortless strength. He swung up behind her, wrapping one strong arm securely around her waist, pulling her back flush against his chest. "Here!" Silas spurred the horse. The buckskin surged forward, its powerful legs eating up the distance as they tore down the main street of Oak Haven. Behind them, spilling out from the alleyway, was Elias Vance. The fire from the stable cast a demonic orange glow over his handsome face, twisting it into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. He saw his wife. He saw the black ledger clutched in her hands. "Clara!" Elias screamed into the night, his voice cracking with rage. He raised a revolver and fired wildly into the dark, but they were already out of range. "I'll kill you! I'll hunt you to the edge of the earth!" Clara didn't look back. She leaned back against the solid wall of Silas's chest, the wind whipping her bloody hair across her face, the rhythmic thunder of the horse's hooves drowning out her husband's threats. She was in agonizing pain, bleeding, and hunted by a corrupt army. But for the first time in 3 years, Clara Vance was free. They rode hard for hours, leaving the flickering lights of Oak Haven far behind, plunging deep into the unforgiving expanse of the Montana frontier. The adrenaline that had fueled Clara through the gunfight had long since evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion that terrified her. Every stride of the horse sent a fresh shockwave of agony through her broken ribs. She was losing blood from the cuts on her face and the deep lacerations on her back where Elias's boots had found their mark. To make matters worse, the territory decided to show its teeth. Shortly after midnight, the temperature plummeted. The sky, previously dusted with stars, bruised over with thick rolling black clouds. The wind picked up, howling across the open plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter, biting sting of a high desert thunderstorm. When the rain hit, it didn't fall. It attacked. It came down in blinding, freezing sheets, turning the dry earth into slick, treacherous mud. Silas cursed under his breath, pulling the brim of his Stetson down low to shield his eyes. He unbuttoned his heavy leather duster, wrapping the thick material as far around Clara as he could manage, shielding her battered frame with his own body. She was shivering so violently her teeth chattered, her skin icy to the touch. The fever that Doc Abernathy had warned about was warring with rapid hypothermia. "Hang on, Clara," Silas shouted over the roar of the driving rain, his breath warm against her freezing ear. "There's an old line shack near the Snake River bend, used by cattle drivers. It ain't the Ritz, but it's got a roof." Clara couldn't respond. She simply gripped his forearm where it was wrapped around her waist, her fingers numb and unfeeling. Another mile of agonizing, freezing darkness passed before the shadowy silhouette of the cabin emerged from the downpour. It was a miserable, rotting structure built of gray, weathered timber. leaning precariously to one side beneath the sheltering limbs of a massive dying cottonwood tree. Silas hauled back on the reins. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the mud. He didn't wait for Clara to try and move. He reached up and pulled her out of the saddle, carrying her to the porch. He kicked the swollen wooden door open, stepping into the pitch-black interior. It smelled of damp earth, old ash, and mice. But it was dry. Silas set Clara down gently on a dusty wooden cot tucked into the corner. He quickly moved back outside, stripping the saddle and the saddlebags from the buckskin, leading the animal under the modest overhang of the porch to escape the worst of the hail that had begun to mix with the rain. When Silas stepped back inside, pushing the heavy door shut against the storm, the silence of the cabin was profound, broken only by the drumming of rain on the tin roof and the ragged, shallow sound of Clara's breathing. Silas didn't waste a second. In the dark, his hands moved with practiced efficiency. He found the rusted cast-iron stove in the center of the room. Beneath it, a small miracle, a stack of dry kindling and a few split logs left behind by the last drifter. He struck a match against his boot heel. The flare of sulfur illuminated his face, hard, scarred, and deeply focused. Within minutes, a fire was crackling in the stove, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the small room. He turned to Clara. She was curled into a tight ball on the cot, still clutching the ledger to her chest. Her lips were a frightening shade of blue, her skin pale as parchment beneath the horrific bruises. Her wet clothes were clinging to her, acting like a shroud of ice. "Clara," Silas said softly, kneeling beside the cot. "Clara, look at me." Her good eye fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "You're freezing to death. I have to get those wet clothes off you." Silas kept his voice entirely clinical, devoid of anything that could be misconstrued as a threat. He knew exactly what kind of trauma she had endured. He knew that the touch of a man, even a man trying to save her, could trigger absolute terror. Clara stared at him. She was delirious, teetering on the edge of the abyss, but the fundamental core of her survival instinct recognized the difference between the predatory, cruel hands of her husband and the steady, respectful hands of the bounty hunter. Slowly, her frozen fingers uncurled from the ledger. She let it drop to the floor. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Silas didn't hesitate, but he didn't rush either. He used his hunting knife to carefully cut away the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of her calico dress and the sodden corset beneath, sparing her the agony of having to sit up or lift her arms. When he finally pulled the wet fabric away, Silas had to clench his jaw so hard it ached to keep from cursing aloud. The bruises Doc Abernathy had bandaged were only the beginning. Her torso was a map of suffering. Faded, yellowing bruises overlapped with vivid purple ones, telling a story of chronic, systemic abuse that stretched back long before last night's brutal attack. There were thin, silver scars on her collarbone and shoulders, the marks of a man who used a riding crop on his wife. A cold, lethal fury settled into Silas's bones. He had hunted men for money, but what he felt toward Elias Vance in this moment transcended any bounty. It was a primal, absolute need to erase the man from the earth. Silas stripped off his own wet duster and shirt. He took his dry wool blanket from his saddlebags, wrapping it tightly around Clara's trembling body. But the fire in the rusted stove wasn't enough to combat the deep, bone-chilling cold that had set into her blood. He knew what he had to do. "I'm going to lay behind you," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I'm going to share my heat, that's all. I won't hurt you, Clara." She closed her eyes, a tear escaping to mix with the dried blood on her cheek. Silas climbed onto the narrow cot. He lay down behind her, carefully wrapping his arms around her blanket-clad form, pulling her back flush against his bare chest. He was a furnace of heat, his large, muscular frame completely enveloping her fragile one. He was careful not to put any pressure on her broken ribs, his hands resting gently, firmly, on her hips. For the first 20 minutes, Clara shook so hard the cot rattled. Silas just held her, murmuring low, nonsensical words of comfort, the kind he used to calm a spooked horse. Slowly, agonizingly, The violent shivering began to subside. The radiant heat of his body penetrated the chill, thawing her out from the inside. The storm raged outside, thunder shaking the very foundations of the cabin, but inside, wrapped in the arms of a killer, Clara felt an alien sensation wash over her. Safety. It was terrifying. For 3 years, the presence of a man behind her in the dark meant pain. It meant holding her breath and bracing for the strike. But Silas's embrace was a fortress. The rhythmic, steady beating of his heart against her back was a drumbeat of protection. He smelled of rain, leather, and gunpowder, and it was the most comforting scent she had ever known. Sometime in the deepest hours of the night, the fever finally broke. Clara let out a long, shaky breath, her mind clearing. She opened her eyes, watching the dying embers glowing through the grate of the iron stove. Silas was awake. She could feel the steady tension in his arms, the protective vigilance of a man who never fully slept. "You're awake," Silas murmured, feeling the shift in her breathing. "I am," Clara whispered. Her throat was dry, but her voice was her own. She shifted slightly within the cocoon of his arms, turning her head just enough to look over her shoulder at him. The firelight caught the harsh planes of his face. He was a dangerous man. The scars that tracked across his jaw and the bridge of his nose spoke of a life steeped in violence. Yet looking into his slate-gray eyes, Clara saw no cruelty. She saw a profound, weary sadness and a fierce, unyielding code of honor. Slowly, testing the boundaries of her own courage, Clara slid one bruised hand out from beneath the blanket. She reached up, her trembling fingers lightly brushing the thick, raised scar that slashed across his jawline. Silas went perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat at the gentle contact. "I've survived a monster," Clara whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the dying fire, her blue eye holding his gaze with a striking, heartbreaking vulnerability. "You're just a man." The words struck Silas harder than the recoil of a Winchester. He looked down at the beautiful, broken woman in his arms, feeling a massive, fundamental shift within his own soul. He had spent his life chasing ghosts, punishing the wicked because he couldn't save his sister. But holding Clara Vance, he realized he didn't just want to avenge the dead anymore. He wanted to protect the living. Silas slowly lifted his large, calloused hand, gently covering her bruised fingers where they rested against his cheek. "I'm just a man," Silas agreed, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. "And as long as there is breath in my lungs, Clara, that monster will never lay a hand on you again." The storm raged on outside the cabin, wild and untamed. But within the walls of the shack, an entirely different kind of storm had broken. The walls between them had crumbled into dust, leaving behind a raw, fragile bond forged in blood, survival, and a quiet, desperate hope. The morning light filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls was the color of bruised iron. The storm had exhausted itself before dawn, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence and a biting cold that seeped through the rotting timber. Clara woke slowly. The fever that had threatened to consume her in the night had broken, leaving her weak, thirsty, and acutely aware of her shattered body. But as she opened her good eye, the first thing she registered wasn't the pain. It was the heavy wool blanket tucked securely around her shoulders, and the lingering scent of smoke, leather, and Silas Thorne. She was alone on the narrow cot. The fire in the cast-iron stove was crackling cheerfully, fighting back the damp chill of the room. Silas was sitting at a small, unsteady wooden table near the lone window, his back to her. He had his Winchester broken down on a scrap of canvas, meticulously cleaning the action with a rag and a small tin of oil. The smooth, rhythmic snick-clack of the metal parts sliding together was strangely soothing. He was fully dressed, his leather duster hanging on a peg to dry, revealing the broad expanse of his shoulders clad in a faded flannel shirt. "You're awake," Silas said, not looking up from the rifle. His hearing was unnervingly sharp. "There's coffee on the stove, tastes like boiled dirt, but it's hot." Clara pushed herself up into a sitting position. A sharp hiss of pain escaped her lips as her cracked ribs protested the movement. Instantly, the metallic clicking stopped. Silas set the rifle down and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't hover, but his large hands were there, hovering just inches from her arms, ready to catch her if she swayed. "I'm all right," Clara breathed, forcing her spine straight. She pulled the blanket tighter around her torn bodice. "I just need a moment." "You need a month in a soft bed," Silas corrected gruffly, pouring a measure of the dark, sludgy coffee into a tin cup. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was warm, rough, and deeply calloused. "Drink." Clara took a sip, grimacing at the bitter taste, but letting the heat radiate through her chest. She looked toward the table. Resting next to the disassembled rifle was the black leather ledger. "Have you opened it?" she asked, her voice raspy. "No," Silas said, pulling up a stool opposite her. "I'm a hunter, Clara, not an accountant. I track footprints, not numbers. That book is your weapon. You tell me how to load it." Clara nodded slowly. She set the tin cup on the floor and swung her bare feet over the edge of the cot. Gritting her teeth against the dull roar of pain in her skull, she walked the 3 steps to the table and sat heavily in the remaining wooden chair. Silas pulled his stool up beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat rolling off his body. She pulled the ledger toward her and flipped it open. The pages were filled with columns of immaculate, sweeping handwriting. Elias Vance was a meticulous man, a trait born of bottomless arrogance. "He didn't think I was smart enough to understand," Clara said quietly, her finger tracing down a column of dates and dollar amounts. "He kept the key to his cipher locked in his desk at the mercantile. But Elias is a creature of habit. He leaves on the 2nd Tuesday of every month for what he calls supply runs. I started matching the dates of his trips to the dates in this book." Silas leaned in, his slate-gray eyes scanning the rows of ink. "He's washing money." "Tens of thousands of dollars," Clara confirmed. "He buys the gold dust and bonds that outlaws steal from the federal stagecoaches, paying them a fraction of the value in clean cash and untraceable supplies. Then he funnels the stolen assets through his legitimate mercantile accounts." She turned the page to a section near the back of the book. Here, the handwriting was sharper, the entries brief and coded. "This is his payroll," Clara explained, her voice hardening. "The men he employs to do the things he's too cowardly to do himself. Bribes to Sheriff Miller. Payoffs to the stagecoach guards to look the other way. And here," she pointed to a column under the heading RCB. "This is the gang that acts as his personal enforcers. He pays them a retainer to keep rival outlaws out of Oakhaven." Silas froze. The air in the cabin seemed to instantly crystallize. Clara felt the sudden, terrifying shift in the man sitting beside her. The warmth radiating from him vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute stillness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She looked at his face. The scarred line of his jaw was locked so tight the muscle twitched. His eyes, staring at the letters RCB, were empty of everything but a dark, bottomless violence. "Silas?" Clara whispered, suddenly afraid. "What is it?" Silas slowly lifted his hand, his thick finger tracing the letters on the page. "RCB, the Rust Creek Boys." "Yes," Clara said, her brow furrowing. "You said last night you were hunting them. You've been tracking them." "I haven't just been tracking them, Clara," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous rasp. "I've been hunting them for 5 years, across 3 territories." He pulled his hand back from the book as if the paper itself were laced with strychnine. He stood up, pacing away from the table, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths. He stopped at the window, staring out at the muddy, rain-swept prairie. 5 years ago, I was riding drag on a cattle drive down in Colorado," Silas began, not turning around. The words sounded as though they were being dragged over broken glass. "I had a younger sister, Lily. She was 16, smart. Too smart for the dirt-poor homestead my old man left us. She wanted to be a school teacher. Clara remained perfectly still, sensing the profound weight of the confession. Silas Thorne was a man who kept his ghosts locked behind iron doors. Opening them now was bleeding him dry. I sent my pay back to her every month, Silas continued, his hands gripping the windowsill so hard the wood groaned. I was saving up to move her east, get her out of the dirt. But the Rust Creek boys hit the valley before I got back. They were looking for a place to lay low after a bank job. They wanted our barn. Lily, she had my father's old shotgun. She tried to run them off. Silas finally turned to face Clara. The raw, unfiltered grief in his eyes was staggering. It made the breath catch in Clara's throat. They burned the house with her inside, Silas said softly. I rode into the valley 2 days later, found nothing but ashes. Clara brought a trembling hand to her mouth. Silas, I'm so sorry. I took up the badge the next week, he said, stepping back toward the table. I've killed 4 of them over the years, but the leader, a butcher named Cowboy, always slipped away. He always seemed to have fresh horses, new guns, and a bottomless supply of cash. He had a ghost backing him. Silas looked down at the black ledger, his eyes burning with a terrible dark revelation. It was Elias. Your husband has been funding the men who murdered my sister. The silence that followed was deafening. The revelation tied their fates together in a knot so tight it could never be unraveled. Silas wasn't just a bounty hunter who had stumbled across a beaten woman. He was the sword of vengeance, and Clara was the map that had finally led him to the heart of his enemy. Clara slowly stood up, ignoring the agonizing stab in her ribs. She took a step toward him, entirely unafraid of the lethal aura radiating from his frame. She reached out, placing her small, bruised hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. It was beating with a slow, heavy, violent rhythm. He took my life from me, too, Clara whispered, her blue eye blazing with a shared, unquenchable fire. He locked me in a cage of fear, beat me until I forgot my own name, and left me in the dirt for the buzzards. We are going to destroy him, Silas. Together. Silas looked down at her hand on his chest. He felt the trembling of her fingers, the fragile cage of her ribs beneath her ruined dress, and the absolute iron-forged courage in her soul. The rage that had been boiling in his blood slowly cooled, tempering into cold, unbreakable steel. He lifted his hand, covering hers, his thumb gently stroking her bruised knuckles. Wyoming, Silas stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. We ride for the Wyoming border. There's a federal marshal stationed in Cheyenne. A man named Holden. He's straight as a plumb line. Straight as a... He can't be bought by Elias's money. We hand him this ledger, and Elias Vance hangs. How far? Clara asked, her chin lifting defiantly. 60 miles of open, hostile country, Silas replied, his eyes tracing the contours of her battered face, a fierce protectiveness surging through him. Elias won't let this book cross the border. He'll have every man on his payroll hunting us by noon. Then we'd better ride, Clara said, pulling her hand from his and reaching for the ledger. Silas watched her, his chest tightening with an emotion that had nothing to do with vengeance. She was broken, bleeding, and hunted by an army, yet she stood taller than any man he had ever known. In that moment, Silas Thorne realized he would burn the entire territory to the ground before he let anyone lay another hand on her. The Montana plains stretched out before them like an endless, undulating ocean of pale green and gold. The storm had washed the dust from the air, leaving the sky an aching, brilliant blue, but the beauty of the frontier was a deceptive liar. There was no cover out here, nowhere to hide a horse and 2 riders from a man who knew the terrain. They rode hard, the powerful buckskin gelding eating up the miles at a steady ground-covering lope. Silas sat in the saddle with the easy, rolling grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback. Clara sat in front of him, cradled securely between his thighs, her back resting flush against his broad chest. Every stride of the horse was a fresh wave of torture. The rhythmic jolting sent sharp, stabbing pains through her fractured ribs, and the friction of the saddle chafed her bruised thighs. She gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity, her teeth gritted so hard her jaw ached, refusing to utter a single sound of complaint. Silas felt her silent agony. His left arm was wrapped firmly around her waist, acting as a brace to absorb as much of the impact as possible. "Breathe, Clara," Silas murmured, his voice a low rumble vibrating against her spine. "Don't fight the horse. Let your body roll with him." "I'm trying," she gasped, her eyes squeezed shut. Silas shifted his grip, his hand resting gently over her stomach, holding her tighter against him. "I know it hurts. You're the toughest goddamn woman I've ever met, but you don't have to prove anything to me. If you need me to stop, you say the word." Clara opened her eyes, looking at the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains marking the Wyoming border. "No stopping. Elias won't." She was right. Silas had been checking his back trail every 15 minutes. For the first few hours, the horizon had been clear. But as the sun crested its zenith, baking the damp earth into hardened clay, Silas pulled his brass spyglass from his saddlebag and brought it to his eye. A dark line of dust was rising against the pale blue sky about 5 miles back. Silas snapped the spyglass shut, his jaw setting into a grim line. "They're on us." "How many?" Clara asked, her pulse spiking, the phantom pain of Elias's fists suddenly throbbing in her face. "A dozen, maybe more," Silas replied, spurring the buckskin into a faster gallop. "Elias must have found our tracks in the mud before the sun baked them dry. He's pushing his horses to death to catch us." The chase became a grueling, desperate race against time and exhaustion. The buckskin was a magnificent animal, bred for endurance, but it was carrying double weight. White foam began to gather at the horse's bit, its sides heaving with the massive effort. The landscape began to change, the rolling plains giving way to rocky, uneven terrain as they neared the territorial border. Scrub pine and sagebrush dotted the landscape, offering a maze of dry gullies and ravines. "We need to cross the river," Silas shouted over the wind. "The Yellowstone is 2 miles ahead. If we cross it, we lose our tracks in the water and put a natural barrier between us and the posse." "Can the horse make it?" Clara asked, wiping a mixture of sweat and dried blood from her brow. "He has to," Silas replied grimly. They crested a rocky ridge and the river came into view. Clara's heart sank. The overnight storm had transformed the usually placid crossing into a churning, violent torrent of muddy brown water. Uprooted tree limbs and debris swept rapidly downstream, caught in the deadly current. Silas didn't hesitate. He guided the buckskin down the steep, shale-covered embankment. The horse snorted nervously, tossing its head as its hooves hit the muddy shoreline. "Hold on to the horn," Silas commanded, unholstering his Winchester from the scabbard. "If the horse loses its footing, do not let go. I'll keep us steady." The buckskin plunged into the freezing water. The current hit them immediately, a massive physical force trying to sweep the horse's legs out from under it. The water rose rapidly, swirling around Silas's boots, then Clara's knees. The horse whinnied in panic, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the slippery riverbed. Crack! The sharp, unmistakable report of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls. A geyser of water erupted less than 3 feet from the horse's nose. Silas whipped his head around. Lined up along the ridge they had just descended were Elias Vance and his posse. Elias was at the center, sitting atop a massive black stallion, a smoking rifle in his hands. Even from across the rushing water, Clara could see the manic, desperate rage contorting her husband's features. "Shoot the horse!" Elias screamed to his men. "Put them in the water!" A terrifying volley of gunfire erupted from the ridge. The air filled with the deadly supersonic whiz and snap of passing bullets. Leads smacked violently into the churning water all around them, sending up sprays of muddy froth. "Hya! Move!" Silas roared, spurring the panicked buckskin, forcing the animal deeper into the channel. The water rose to the horse's chest. It began to swim, fighting the relentless drag of the current. Clara flattened herself against the horse's neck, making herself as small a target as possible. She could hear Elias screaming her name, a sound that chilled her to the bone more than the freezing river. Silas twisted in the saddle, raising the Winchester one-handed. He fired 3 rapid shots back at the ridge. He didn't aim to kill, he aimed to suppress. One of Elias's men clutched his shoulder and pitched backward off his horse, causing the men next to him to duck for cover. It bought them 3 precious seconds. The buckskin's hooves finally struck the rocky bottom of the far bank. The horse lunged forward, scrambling frantically up the muddy embankment, its powerful hind legs driving them out of the water. Crack! A final desperate shot rang out from the ridge. Silas let out a sharp, violent grunt. His entire body jerked violently forward, slamming into Clara's back. The Winchester slipped from his grasp, splashing into the shallow water at the river's edge. "Silas!" Clara screamed, turning as far as the saddle would allow. "Keep riding!" Silas choked out, his voice suddenly breathless and tight. His right arm hung useless at his side, his left hand gripping the reins with terrifying white-knuckled desperation. He dug his spurs into the exhausted horse. The buckskin lunged up over the lip of the embankment, crashing into a dense thicket of scrub pine and boulders, completely breaking the line of sight from the river. They were safely across, shielded by the rugged terrain of the Wyoming border. Silas pulled the horse to a sudden, jarring halt in the shadow of a massive sandstone boulder. The moment the horse stopped moving, Silas swayed dangerously in the saddle. His eyes rolled back and he began to slide sideways. "No, no, no! Silas!" Clara twisted around, grabbing a fistful of his heavy leather duster, ignoring the screaming agony in her own ribs. She hauled backward with every ounce of strength she possessed, using her body weight to keep him from falling into the dirt. She looked at his back. High on his right shoulder blade, the thick leather of his coat was torn. Blood, dark, hot and terrifyingly thick, was pulsing from the wound, already soaking the fabric and dripping down the saddle to mingle with the sweat of the horse. Elias hadn't missed. Silas's head slumped against Clara's shoulder, his breathing ragged and shallow. The invincible bounty hunter, the man who had pulled her from the edge of the grave, was bleeding out in the saddle. "Silas, look at me," Clara pleaded, her voice cracking with terror as she pressed her hand desperately against the bleeding wound. Her hands were covered in his blood. "Stay with me, Silas, please." Silas managed to open his eyes, the slate-gray irises clouded with pain. He looked at her face, reaching up with his good left hand to smear a streak of dirt and water from her cheek. "We made it across," he whispered, a faint ghost of a smile touching his pale lips, before his eyes rolled back, and he slipped entirely into unconsciousness. Clara sat there in the silence of the canyon, holding the bleeding man in her arms. The posse was stuck on the other side of the swollen river, but they would find a crossing. They always did. Clara Vance looked down at her bloody hands, then up at the treacherous, winding canyon path ahead. She was a battered woman, hunted by an army, carrying a dying man and the deadliest ledger in the territory. Her fear was gone, burned away by the fire in Silas's blood. In its place was an absolute cold-blooded resolve. She gathered the reins in her bruised hands, kicked her boots into the buckskin's flanks, and rode deeper into the wild. The Wyoming border was a jagged, unforgiving labyrinth of red rock and winding ravines. Clara rode for an hour, the buckskin gelding's lathered sides heaving with every step, until the narrow trail abruptly terminated. They were in a box canyon. Sheer, unscalable walls of sun-baked sandstone rose 50 feet on 3 sides, leaving only the narrow bottleneck entrance they had just passed through. It was a dead end. Clara hauled back on the reins. Silas groaned, a wet, rattling sound deep in his chest. He was slipping fast. The blood had soaked through his duster, staining the saddle blanket and Clara's own torn dress. "Silas," Clara gasped, her muscles screaming in protest as she awkwardly dismounted. She hit the ground hard, her broken ribs flaring with a blinding, white-hot agony that dropped her to her knees. She bit through her lower lip, tasting copper, and forced herself back up. She reached up, grabbing Silas by his heavy leather coat, and practically dragged his dead weight from the saddle. He collapsed into the red dirt, his long legs sprawling awkwardly. Clara dropped beside him, her trembling hands tearing at his shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had entered high on the back of his right shoulder, missing the spine by a fraction of an inch, but it hadn't exited. The muscle was torn and bleeding heavily. Clara stripped off the remnants of her own petticoat, wadding the linen into a tight ball, and pressed it directly into the wound with both hands. Silas let out a raw, guttural shout of pain, his back arching off the dirt. His slate-gray eyes snapped open, wide and wild, before focusing on Clara's face hovering above his. I'm sorry, she wept, her tears mixing with the blood on her hands as she applied brutal, necessary pressure. You're losing too much blood. Silas stared up at the sheer rock walls of the canyon, his mind fighting through the fog of agony. He recognized the terrain. They were trapped. He reached up with his left hand, his blood-slick fingers wrapping around her wrist. Stop, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Clara, stop. No, I have to stop the bleeding. Listen to me, Silas commanded, his tone brokering no argument despite its weakness. He forced himself to sit up against the base of a boulder, his face completely drained of color. Elias will find the crossing. He's an hour behind us, maybe less. You can't fight a dozen men in a dead end. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt with his good hand, sliding the holstered Colt .45 and the loops of brass cartridges toward her. Then he nodded toward the buckskin. Take the horse. Take the ledger, Silas ordered, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, heartbreaking intensity. Ride back out the bottleneck and head due south. You'll hit the main territorial road in 5 miles. Flag down a stagecoach or a marshal patrol. Do not stop for anyone else. Clara stared at the gun belt in the dirt, then up at his pale, sweating face. And what are you going to do? I've still got my Winchester, Silas said, patting the rifle leaning against the rock. I'll hole up in the rocks at the entrance. I can hold them off long enough for you to disappear. You have one good arm, and half your blood is in the dirt, Clara said, her voice trembling not with fear but with a rising, incandescent anger. They will slaughter you. I'm a dead man either way, Clara, Silas finally shouted, the effort costing him a grimace of profound pain. He softened his voice, his eyes pleading with her. I've spent my whole life hunting men who ruin things. Let me do one good thing before I go. Let me save you, please. For 3 years, Clara Vance had been told what to do. She had been ordered to sit down, to keep quiet, to take the beatings, and to run when she was told to run. She looked at the bleeding bounty hunter who had shielded her with his own body. She looked at the black ledger strapped to the saddle. And then she looked around the desolate box canyon. Her mind, sharp and meticulous, began to turn gears. Elias hadn't just used his ledger to track bribes. He had recorded real estate. She remembered a specific entry from 2 years ago. Purchased 3 abandoned silver claims in the deep Wyoming ridges. Useless rock. Good for burying assets. Equipment left on site. Clara stood up. She wiped the blood from her hands onto her ruined dress. No, she said coldly. Silas blinked, confused by the sudden chilling shift in her demeanor. Clara, this isn't a negotiation. I said no, Silas Thorne, she interrupted, turning her back on the horse. She began walking toward the rear of the canyon, where a dark fissure in the rock face suggested a shallow cave. I am done running from Elias Vance. I am done letting men bleed for me. We are not dying in this canyon. He is. What are you doing? Silas rasped, trying to push himself up, but his body betrayed him, sending him slumping back against the rock. Elias bought this claim to wash money, Clara called back over her shoulder, disappearing into the dark maw of the cave. A moment later, the sound of wooden crates being dragged across stone echoed through the canyon. He bought the land, the shafts, and everything the prospectors left behind when the silver dried up. When Clara emerged from the cave, Silas's heart nearly stopped. She was carrying a heavy wooden crate, her arms straining, her face pale with the agonizing effort against her broken ribs. Stenciled on the side of the decaying wood, barely legible through the dust, was the word, Danger, Hercules Powder Company. Dynamite, Silas breathed, awe warring with terror. "The prospectors left it," Clara panted, setting the crate down gently near the bottleneck entrance of the canyon. She pried the rotting lid off with Silas's hunting knife. Inside, nestled in sawdust, were a dozen waxy cylindrical sticks. They were old, sweating nitroglycerin, unstable and incredibly lethal. Clara worked with terrifying precision. She had meticulously read every invoice Elias had ever filed. She knew exactly how mining charges were set. She gathered the sweating sticks, placing them strategically at the base of the towering, precarious sandstone overhang that formed the narrowest part of the canyon entrance. She found a spool of degrading fuse wire in the cave, measuring out a length that stretched from the explosives back to the heavy boulder where Silas was slumped. She wired the blasting caps, her bruised, bloody fingers moving with a surgeon's care. "Clara," Silas said softly as she knelt beside him, unspooling the last of the fuse. "If that rock comes down, it'll seal the canyon. We'll be trapped in here." "I know," Clara said, taking his heavy Colt .45 from the dirt. She checked the cylinder, her thumb expertly pulling back the hammer to ensure a round was chambered. "But Elias will be trapped under it." She sat down in the red dirt beside Silas, her back resting against the same boulder. She laid the Colt across her lap and took his large, cold left hand in her own. The silence of the canyon was absolute. The trap was set. The prey had become the predator. "Now," Clara whispered, her blue eye fixed on the narrow entrance of the canyon, "we wait." The wait was an excruciating eternity. The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly, baking the canyon into a stone oven. Silas drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow, his hand gripping Clara's with a desperate fading strength. Then she heard it, the clatter of iron horseshoes on loose shale, the low, aggressive murmur of men's voices, the creak of saddle leather. Clara's pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her eardrums. She shifted slightly, raising the Colt .45, her finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. She held the end of the fuse wire in her other hand. She didn't have matches. The spark would have to come from the gun. "Tracks lead right in here, boss," Briggs's voice echoed off the canyon walls, magnified by the narrow stone corridor. "It's a box canyon," Elias's voice replied, ringing with a cruel, triumphant certainty. "They're trapped. Spread out. Check the ridges, then move in. I want the bounty hunter dead, but leave my wife to me. I have a lesson to finish teaching her." The shadows of horses elongated across the red dirt at the canyon's entrance. Clara held her breath. "Wait. Let them get under the overhang." One rider appeared, then three, then Elias Vance himself sitting tall on his black stallion, his Winchester resting across his saddle horn. He rode directly under the massive, towering sandstone arch where Clara had packed the sweating dynamite. 6 men followed him in, bottlenecking in the narrow pass. "Clara, darling," Elias called out, his voice a mocking sing-song echo. Come out, the game is over." Clara didn't blink. She lowered the barrel of the Colt, aiming directly at the spark cap attached to the end of the fuse wire coiled in the dirt 10 feet away. Exhale. She squeezed the trigger. The Colt roared. The bullet struck the cap with a spark of bright, brilliant ignition. The fuse hissed to life, a fast-moving snake of white-hot fire racing toward the canyon entrance. Elias's head snapped toward the sound of the gunshot. He saw the sparking fuse racing toward the rock wall. His aristocratic mask of confidence vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. "Back!" Elias screamed, violently hauling his horse around. "Ride back!" It was too late. The explosion tore the world apart. The shockwave hit Clara like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and raining a shower of red dust and small pebbles over her and Silas. The deafening, cataclysmic boom echoed for miles. The structural integrity of the sandstone overhang shattered. Thousands of tons of solid rock sheared away from the canyon wall, plummeting downward in a devastating avalanche of stone and choking dust. The screams of the posse and the panicked shrieking of horses were instantly silenced, buried beneath a mountain of rubble. For a long minute, the canyon was plunged into a twilight of thick, suffocating red dust. Clara coughed, waving her hand in front of her face, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Beside her, Silas stirred, groaning as the concussive force jostled his bleeding shoulder. As the dust slowly began to settle, settling over the newly formed wall of collapsed rock that completely sealed the canyon entrance, Clara gripped the Colt tighter and stood up. She stepped out from behind the boulder. The massacre was absolute. The Rust Creek boys were gone, crushed beneath the avalanche. But as the smoke cleared near the edge of the rubble, something moved. Elias Vance crawled out from the debris. His black stallion was dead, crushed beneath a boulder, but Elias had miraculously been thrown clear of the main collapse. He was covered in gray rock dust, his fine clothes torn, blood trailing from a gash on his forehead. He staggered to his feet, wheezing, his Winchester lost in the rubble. He looked around at the graveyard of his men, and then his dark eyes locked onto Clara. She stood 30 feet away, the heavy Colt .45 leveled squarely at his chest. For a second, Elias looked genuinely shocked. Then the shock melted away, replaced by the deep, ingrained arrogance of a man who had never truly been held accountable for anything. He wiped the blood from his eyes, letting out a dark, mocking chuckle. He didn't draw the silver-plated revolver holstered at his hip. Instead, he unbuckled his gun belt entirely, letting it drop to the dirt. He raised his hands, his palms open, and began to walk slowly toward her. "Well, well, well," Elias crooned, his voice dripping with that familiar hypnotic cadence he used to break her down. "Look at you, playing the outlaw." Clara's hands began to shake. The sight of him walking toward her, unarmed and smiling, triggered a primal, deeply conditioned terror. The phantom pain of his fists struck her jaw, her ribs, her spine. Her breathing grew shallow. "Put the gun down, Clara," Elias said softly, taking another step. The distance between them was closing. 20 feet. "You don't have the stomach for this. You're a gentle creature, a fragile thing. You know what happens when you disobey me." "Stop," Clara ordered, her voice trembling. "I know you're angry," Elias continued, his tone shifting to false, sickening sympathy. He took another step, 15 feet. "You have a right to be. I lost my temper. But that drifter poisoned your mind against me. We can go home, Clara. I forgive you. I forgive you." The words were a physical weight pressing down on her chest. For 3 years, those words had been the chain that bound her to hell. "I said stop!" Clara shouted, gripping the Colt with both hands to steady the barrel. Elias stopped 10 feet away. He dropped his hands, his smile fading into a look of absolute chilling possession. He looked at the trembling barrel of the gun, then up into her eye. He deployed his final, most devastating weapon. "You can't shoot me, Clara," Elias whispered, stepping into her personal space, his dark eyes boring into her soul. "Because you know exactly who you belong to." The canyon went dead silent. The ringing in Clara's ears faded. She could hear the ragged breathing of Silas bleeding behind her. She could feel the agonizing throbbing of her broken ribs. She looked at the man who had tried to beat her into the grave. She looked at the hands that had caused her so much pain. Suddenly, the shaking stopped. The heavy steel of the Colt felt perfectly still in her bruised hands. The terrified, submissive wife vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving only the woman who had dragged herself out of the dirt. Clara met his gaze. Her blue eye was as cold and hard as a glacier. "I belong to myself," Clara said. She pulled the trigger. Bang! Elias didn't even have time to register the shift in her eyes. The .45 caliber bullet shattered his right kneecap. Elias screamed a high, piercing wail of agony and crumpled to the dirt. He clutched his ruined leg, thrashing in the red dust, his aristocratic facade completely obliterated by pure animalistic pain. Clara took a step forward, towering over him. She cocked the hammer back a second time. Click! Elias looked up, his eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. He reached out with his right hand, the hand that had broken her ribs, the hand that had paid the men who murdered Silas's sister, to beg for mercy. Bang! Clara's second shot blew through the palm of his right hand, shattering the bones. Elias collapsed into the dirt, weeping, broken and utterly powerless. Clara slowly lowered the smoking gun. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel joy. She felt a profound, overwhelming emptiness that was rapidly filling with the clean, pure air of absolute freedom. "Hold your fire! Federal marshals, drop your weapons!" The authoritative shout echoed from the ridgeline above the collapsed canyon entrance. Clara looked up. Lining the rim of the canyon, rifles leveled, were a dozen men wearing the brass stars of the United States Marshal Service. Silas's telegram from Oakhaven had reached Cheyenne in time. Clara didn't drop the gun immediately. She turned her back on her weeping, crippled husband and walked back to the boulder. She dropped to her knees beside Silas. He was barely conscious, but his slate-gray eyes were open, watching her. He had seen it all. Clara dropped the Colt into the dirt. She carefully laid her head against his uninjured chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. "It's over, Silas," she whispered, her tears finally falling, washing the blood and dirt from his shirt. "We're safe. We're free." Silas managed to lift his heavy hand, his calloused fingers weakly brushing her hair. "Told you," he breathed, a bloody, exhausted smile touching his lips. "Toughest woman I ever met." The federal courthouse in Cheyenne, Wyoming, smelled of polished oak, beeswax, and absolute finality. Clara sat in the witness box, her back perfectly straight. The horrific bruising on her face had faded to pale, yellowish shadows over the last month, but the emotional scars were a armor she wore with quiet dignity. She wore a tailored, modest dress purchased with her own money, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Across the courtroom, sitting at the defense table, was Elias Vance. He was a shell of the man who had ruled Oakhaven. His right leg was encased in a rigid splint, a heavy wooden crutch resting against his chair. His right hand was heavily bandaged, useless and mangled. He looked pale, hollow, and utterly defeated. He refused to meet her eye. The trial had been swift and merciless. The Black Ledger was a devastating piece of evidence. It meticulously documented a decade of extortion, robbery, and murder. Coupled with Clara's calm, unflinching testimony about the brutal realities of her marriage and the attempted murder on the prairie, the defense attorney had practically given up on the first day. Even Sheriff Miller, who had been arrested in Oakhaven a week prior, had turned state's evidence to save his own neck, confirming every line of Clara's story. Judge Harrison, a stern man with a walrus mustache, banged his gavel. The courtroom fell silent. "Elias Vance," the judge boomed, his voice carrying the full weight of the United States government. "You have been found guilty of grand larceny, conspiracy to commit murder, the funding of outlaw enterprises, and the brutal, grievous assault of your wife, Clara Vance. A man who uses his wealth to corrupt the law and his fists to terrorize his own home has no place in a civilized territory." Clara didn't blink. She watched her husband flinch. "I sentence you to be taken from this courtroom to the territorial prison," the judge continued coldly, "where you shall be hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your black soul." The gavel cracked like a gunshot. There was no outburst from Elias. He didn't scream or threaten her as he had in the alleyways of Oakhaven. He simply put his head down as the federal marshals hauled him roughly to his feet, shackling his good hand to his waist. As they led him past the witness box, Elias finally looked up at Clara. There was nothing left in his eyes but the pathetic, lingering shadow of a broken tyrant. Clara looked back at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The ghost was finally dead. When the courtroom cleared, Clara walked out into the bright Wyoming sunshine. Waiting for her at the bottom of the courthouse steps was Silas Thorne. He looked different. The heavy, dust-caked leather duster was gone, replaced by a clean canvas jacket and a crisp white shirt. His right arm was in a sling, the shoulder wound healing slowly but cleanly under Doc Abernathy's initial care, and the military surgeons in Cheyenne. The silver bounty hunter badge was noticeably missing from his chest. He had turned it in that morning. The Rust Creek boys were dead, and their benefactor was on his way to the gallows. Silas's long hunt was finally over. Clara walked down the steps, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face for the first time in years. Silas stepped forward, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her, not a desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss of survival, but a slow, deep, terrifyingly tender promise of a future. "It's done," Clara murmured against his lips. "Yeah," Silas rumbled, resting his forehead against hers. "It's done. What happens now, Mrs. Vance?" Clara pulled back slightly, her blue eyes sparkling with a fierce, brilliant light. "Well, Mr. Thorne, thanks to a very efficient federal liquidation, I am now the sole legal owner of half the Vance estate's clean assets. It seems I'm a very wealthy woman." She smoothed the lapel of his jacket. "And I happen to know a retired bounty hunter who needs a job." Silas chuckled, a rich, warm sound that made her heart flutter. "Is that right? And what kind of job are you offering?" "I was thinking we'd buy some land," Clara said, looking northward toward the distant rolling plains. "In Montana, a place where the sky is wide open and nobody tells me what to do. I need a partner to help me run it." Silas looked down at the woman who had dragged him from the darkness, the woman who had stared down a monster and won. "I reckon I can handle that," Silas said softly. 3 years later. The Montana sun was a gentle golden warmth on the wide wraparound porch of the Thorne Ranch. Clara sat in a beautifully carved wooden rocking chair, humming a soft, wordless lullaby. In her arms, swaddled in a soft cotton blanket, was her newborn son. He had Silas's dark hair, and already a stubborn set to his tiny jaw. Clara looked out over the sprawling acres of prime grazing land. Hundreds of healthy cattle dotted the Emerald Hills. The ranch was a massive, thriving enterprise, built from the liquidated ashes of Elias Vance's dirty empire, and run with the absolute unyielding integrity of Silas Thorne. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden steps made Clara smile before she even turned her head. Silas walked up onto the porch. He was covered in the honest dust of a hard day's work, his Stetson pushed back on his head. The scars on his face hadn't faded, but the weariness in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering devotion. He knelt beside the rocking chair, his large, calloused hand reaching out to gently brush the downy hair of his sleeping son. Then he looked up at Clara. The reverence in his slate-gray eyes stole her breath just as it had every day for the last 3 years. "He's got your eyes," Silas whispered. "He's got your stubbornness," Clara teased, leaning into his touch as he cupped her cheek. She reached up, her hand resting over his. As the sunlight caught her knuckles, the faint silvered scars from the night in the stables gleamed. Once she had looked at those scars and seen a victim. She had seen the marks of a man who tried to make her body her grave. But as she sat on the porch of the empire she had built, surrounded by the wide-open sky and anchored by the love of a man who treated her as an equal, Clara Thorne realized the truth. She hadn't just survived the fire. She had become it. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.